さらば地球よ旅立つ船は宇宙戦艦ヤマト宇宙の彼方スカンダルへ運命背負い今飛び立つ必ずここへ帰ってくると手を振る人に笑顔で答え
Above the stars are bright, but I'm blinded by your light. Heaven seems so far away. Come back to me someday.
Welcome to Journey Through Sci-Fi, with me, James.
And me, Matt. Every series on this podcast, we explore the world of science fiction cinema by taking a trip through a different subgenre of sci-fi.
This series, our journey is through the fantastical world of space opera. Hello, listeners. We are back for another jam-packed episode. This week on the podcast, we are in space once again in our space opera series. This time, we're taking a little trip to Japan to look at a couple of long-running anime series that have had a big impact on space opera in general and offer a lot to discuss for the episode, I would say.
And slightly transition us into a more modern era of space opera as well. There's a noticeable tonal shift here that we will be getting into that I don't know if it's a geographical tonal shift because these are Japanese stories being told or if it's to do with the time they were made, but it is noticeable that we're dealing with more serious space operas here.
Yes, finally getting into some serious space opera.
Maybe only temporarily. So what are the two anime series that we've looked at this week, James?
So this week we have watched plenty of episodes of Space Battleship Yamato from 1974, and we've also paired that with another long-running anime series, Legend of the Galactic Heroes from 1988.
And these are both amazing, but we should say that if you are a fan of these two anime series, James and I have just been dipping our toes in these franchises this week. Space Battleship Yamato existing in many formats over the decades, and Legend of Galactic Heroes also in many formats, and a very long-running anime series released in 4 sections. So we've dipped into these to get a bit of an experience to talk about them today, but there's plenty more to go out there.
Oh, definitely. And as Matt said, there's lots of different renditions of these anime series, but the ones we specifically looked at are the 1974 series of Space Battleship Yamato and the 1988 original series of Legend of the Galactic Heroes.
Well, let's get started with the journey of the Battleship Yamato from 1974. Or Starblazers, as it was known in the US.
Starblazers, yeah.
一大ブームの渦に巻き込んだ SF 冒険アクションついに完成新たな構想のもとに2年の歳月と2億円の巨費を投じた超話題作宇宙戦艦ヤマト
Off to outer space, we're leaving Mother Earth to save the human race. Our Starblazers, searching for a distant star, heading off to Iskandar, leaving all we love behind. Who knows what dangers we'll find? We must be strong and brave. Our home we've got to save. If we don't, in just 1 year, Mother Earth will disappear.
Okay, so this was before Star Wars. This came out in 1974 and was a hugely influential series in Japan. It spawned loads of merchandise. Kids loved it. It was initially targeted at sort of teenagers and boys, but they got lots of fan mail from young girls, and it really sort of broadened the sense of space opera in Japan. And the feature film cut of the first series was actually more popular than Star Wars when that was released in 1977 in Japan. So it topped that. So what did you make of Space Battleship Yamato first off then, Matt? And what did you know much about it before you went in for the episode?
No, I don't think I'd ever heard of it before. So I was digging through Wikipedia, all the various versions of it, and just being like, oh wow, there's quite a lot to get through here. And that kind of cult status or the cultural importance of it in Japan in particular hyped it up a little bit for me. And I have to say, in the first few episodes, I was wondering what all the fuss was about, like it's fairly generic and it kind of looks like a kids anime series.
Yeah.
But as you go along with it, the more serious stuff just sort of peaks its head up and you get these quite heavy dramatic moments or episodes peppered in throughout, and particularly towards the end, things just start to get quite unexpectedly dark. Or it shouldn't be unexpected, I guess, for the overall plot. The plot has this ticking clock of disaster for the entire planet Earth. So it should be expected, and they sort of deliver on that. So it's a nice build, and I can see why, if that wasn't common in anime in the early 70s, getting to episode 26 of this, your mind would be blown by the kind of journey that you've gone on with these characters.
Yeah, and I think as well, the influence of this, because you're right, it does seem a bit more targeted at kids when you first watch the first few episodes. You can see it. It seems like simplified anime compared to what we're used to today, the kind of stuff that we'd watch. But the thing is, this was kind of the first of its kind, wasn't it? It was turning towards these serious themes and these big storylines. If you look at stuff like Gundam and Evangelion and Macross, they've all taken influences from Yamato, because they wouldn't exist if this series hadn't come out. And I think that's like a big sell for this as well.
Yeah.
And also just listeners, it's worth noting that you can watch the first series on YouTube. I found a playlist which was a godsend for this episode, and it's got like all 26 episodes. They've all been subtitled, and they're quite easy to access.
And I think that's all done by a group of fans who've also done the translation themselves. So fair play to them, and thank you to the team at Central Anime Kansas, who I think are behind that on YouTube, doing great work there to preserve this classic.
Yeah, definitely. Always good when you can get hold of this kind of stuff in an easy way, especially with there being so many different streaming services that take stuff like this off of their services. But anyway.
Just a little bit of bitterness there.
Just a tad. So anyway, Space Battleship Yamato, it was called Starblazers in the US when they dubbed it over there, and they took a lot of stuff out of the US version. So how do you think this sci-fi show in particular differs from what we might see in Western culture?
At its very core, there's this very Japanese historical sense of like national pride in the fact that the Yamato is based on, and I think constructed from, in the story, a real Japanese battleship from the Second World War that's been kind of refitted and rebuilt as a spaceship. And it's kind of gone into legend in Japanese naval terms. It was this enormous battleship that got sent on a fairly doomed mission for the Japanese at the end of the Second World War, went to an inevitable defeat, beached itself deliberately so that they'd all fight to the death to defend an island against the US, and ultimately, as we know, they lost, and I think the Japanese surrendered to the US towards the end of the war. So it's got this kind of sense of a doomed, proud nation, having one last stab at things at the end of the war. That I think is quite hard to translate for an American audience, particularly for an American audience who are not going to be very interested at all in hearing about national pride, about the Japanese fleet from the Second World War. So I can't imagine how you would sell that. I think just ignore all of that when translating it, I would imagine, and just don't acknowledge that it's a Japanese battleship.
You'd be right there. They completely got rid of all of that, and I think they referred to it as the Argo instead.
Yeah, okay, that's like a Greek reference. There,
Yeah, like Jason in the Argonauts. So the Argo is the ship they traveled on. So they just get rid of all of those kind of references. And yeah, the Yamato is so fascinating as well because the original battleship was Japan's answer to the US naval fleet. So the US had more ships. So Japan instead just made one massive ship. And that was their going to be their main fighting force. But I think it was sunk before it ever had a chance to like get in any sort of naval fights on the water. I think it was something like that. But having this great ship, which obviously is a symbol for pride in some ways for Japan, and then having that as the thing that becomes this spaceship, which is going to help save Earth from this catastrophe. And the fact that the catastrophe that is happening on Earth is this radiation that is happening from these bombs sent by this alien race as well must resonate with a Japanese audience as well, just given everything from World War II.
So I think it is so Japanese. So most anime is, but a lot of anime, especially nowadays, translates very easily and it is welcomed by an American and international audience. But this one, it does feel really like a uniquely Japanese product. But all that being said, within the plot, I don't think the characters approach things from a sense of Japanese national pride. It actually feels like it's an international effort. The ship is built in Japan by a Japanese team, but they're working for Earth and with the Earth Defense Force, and they reference other countries that are all cooperating together. It's not like a kind of... It's not exclusionary to other nations or hostile to other nations. It's just like Japan's leading the charge to save the Earth and we're all working together on it. But it's got all these tropes that resonate in a particular way with a Japanese audience that wouldn't translate as well overseas.
And what's resonating with that audience and what that audience is used to in terms of anime as well, there's always this, because we've talked about this in previous episodes when we covered anime on the show, how anime and animation wasn't seen as just a purely for a younger audience. Yet when Starblazers went over to the US, it was just targeted at kids because that's what they knew of anime and animation at that time. So one of the other things that they cut was there's lots of like alcohol references. The Doctor in this show is constantly drinking, as they've cut all of that. And also there's the infamous fan service that happens in a lot of anime, which is basically just perving on women. The character of Yuki Mori, she is the only real female character other than this alien princess who comes up in a few episodes. And there's lots of instances in the show where you've got the robot, which is very reminiscent of R2-D2, this robot called Analyzer, who is pulling up Yuki's skirts, tugging at her and like touching her bum and all this kind of stuff, which didn't go over to the US series, surprisingly, for the kids. But it's just interesting seeing that again and seeing what was in this show when it aired in Japan and what got taken out.
Yeah, the robot was hard to get on board with. I mean, all of those things that you just listed were the main things I didn't like about this show. The Doctor is a truly baffling character to me. He's a vet. He's a veterinarian, and he's the only doctor they take on their year-long mission. We haven't described the plot, have we? We should just quickly
let's go over
summarize the plot. As you say, Earth is under attack and being irradiated by bombs from a hostile alien race that nobody really knows anything about. The Battleship Yamato is constructed as this kind of last-ditch effort by humanity to go on this enormous mission, 146,000 light years to the other side of, or to a different galaxy even, because someone mysterious has sent a message saying, I've got a device that can save Earth, so come collect it, you're welcome to it. And get back within 1 year. That's the plot. So within that, we have a cast of characters, some of which you would imagine. We've got a kind of stoic, heroic captain Captain Birdseye type guy.
Captain Birdseye.
And then we've got this younger crew. But along with that, the doctor they take with them is a vet who is constantly drunk. And he's drawn in that kind of 70s, 80s anime style when it's an unserious character where he's very a highly stylized, squat appearance. You know, he doesn't look like a normal human like the rest of the characters do. And he's got a little robot buddy that's always trying to touch the bum or marry the only woman. Oh God, I don't like talking about this.
There's one episode when she complains to the captain about it, and she says, like, look, I can't deal with this. I'm being sexually harassed by this robot. Can we fix the robot? And the captain kind of dismisses it a bit. He's like, oh, well, we need the robot. It's very important.
Oh yeah, the robot does do useful stuff, but he also gets drunk in one episode when he should be disarming mines.
Wow, it goes on some twists, this series, to say the least.
Yeah, look, that's enough for them. There's these characters. I don't think they fit that well with the show, but I guess they feel like a product of their times. Let's talk about some of the other characters. What were your thoughts on the captain, for example, Captain Akita?
Well, Captain Akita's really interesting because it's the Navy in space. Their ship is based on a naval ship. The way that they're fighting is kind of in this naval way. The captain dresses like a Navy officer because that's what he's used to. And it's just this evolution of the Navy into space.
Yeah, well, and fairly common in sci-fi, particularly in space opera. Star Wars has fleets and admirals. Star Trek, Starfleet. Starfleet is a fleet, and their ranks are based on naval ranks. It's captain, ensign, admiral. Those are... I don't know enough about the American military, but particularly I think admiral is more of a naval thing. I don't really know why. I don't know why that is a historical trope in science fiction. There's something... I just feel like because the Navy's existed longer, you've got armies on foot that have existed since civilization, and you've had a naval history that's several hundred years old all over the world, whereas air forces are, you know, just sort of early to mid 20th century invention. So maybe there's more of a sense of history by basing things on a naval fleet rather than air force. But generally, most sci-fi that has a big military space presence tend to go down the naval route. There are some, I feel like Space Above and Beyond is a bit more like Top Gun guys in space, but even like Battlestar Galactica is like a ragtag fleet of boats. I think it's something about floating through space rather than flying through space.
I think you're right, because it's like the way that they're traveling through space, it's like a sea because they're continuously traveling along it. They don't really have breaks.
Yeah.
And yeah, usually when you're flying, you land somewhere, but they don't really land, do they? They're constantly just afloat in the vastness of space.
But in particular here, we're harking back to the Japanese naval heritage. Japan's got an imperial history. It had an empire and had a pretty serious naval presence because it's a series of islands. So that's another aspect that I think is really important. I think that's one of the things that's very Japanese in this, but actually translates quite well outside of Japan. Certainly, I don't know if that would hit the same in 1974, but now to me, naval traditions in space feels right and resonates quite well. And that kind of national pride thing, I think, has actually resonated, outside.
Yeah, I'd agree. And I think that the Navy setup's good because you've got this captain and he's the leader, but he's also this old wise man that we see in lots of different space operas because he's got a big old grey beard and he's giving everybody advice. He knows what to do. Later on in the series, he does take a back seat from his captain duties and kind of passes the reins to the next generation. But it's all of this stuff that he's the mentor, which is so much a part of space opera in general. And this has also been, a few people have cited Space Battleship Yamato as a potential influence for Star Wars as well.
Right.
And you can see certain bits of that in there, at least like when you look at it. Stuff like the dogfights in space, they do have that element. They've also got Analyzer, who is very R2-D2. Also the fact that they're getting a message from an alien princess giving them this secret technology or this insight into this technology which can save them from this cataclysm that's going to happen. And they've also got this wave motion gun that is basically equivalent to the Death Star, but they have it on the Yamato.
Yeah.
So they've got this big ray which can destroy a planet from the looks of it. There's lots of comparisons to be made in there, but then you've got other characters, like you've got Kodai, who is the sort of the lead protagonist, who is this kind of Luke Skywalker-ish character, but he's not. He's kind of like more Han Solo though, as well I'd say, because he is this kind of. He's a bit rebellious and will just do stuff because he wants to do it. He's always going off half-cocked on different missions, and he's got these really inbuilt revenge motives as well, because he lost his brother from the initial battle with the aliens, these blue aliens called they're from planet Gamulus.
Gamulus. Yeah. It changes in different translations.
And so he's got these revenge motives which just fuel all of his anger. And as the series progresses, you learn more about this alien race and just see the similarities between the humans and them. They're basically humanoid, these people that they're battling. So you get more of a sense of who's in the right here and what's gone on before.
Yeah, I think there are definitely analogues to Star Wars. And I wouldn't be surprised if it was an influence, because we know Lucas was watching Japanese stuff, wasn't he? He's heavily influenced by The Hidden Fortress, making the first Star Wars film. So this could have been on his radar ahead of that and influencing him as well. I think if you look at the Star Wars trilogy more broadly as well, Kodai, he crosses over Luke Skywalker and Han Solo a bit, but his overall character arc, the maturing of Kodai across the series, is reminiscent of how Luke goes from the naive farm boy to the wise Jedi Knight by the third film. That there is this maturity because Kodai steps up into a leadership role. He's a naive, angry trainee soldier, basically, and gets thrust into responsibility because of Akita taking a back step from being the captain. There is this maturing of Kodai as it goes on, but he's always got that kind of like angry edge. He's at the forefront of a genocide, basically. When I was talking about, as the series goes on, you're hit with these very serious moments. That one really took me by surprise. There's an episode at the end where they finally defeat the Gamulus, but in the process of doing so, they basically destroy the entire planet. And Kodai has this horrible realization that, like, oh, most of the people on this planet weren't evil. There was an evil emperor here, and they were just trying to escape death. And it's absolutely miserable. It's so bleak. And so dark and quite unexpected in a series about hope, about bringing hope back to Earth, and a fairly youth-oriented seeming show, to have a character acknowledge that he's basically committed genocide and then just get on with the mission is incredibly surprising.
But I think it's also because it is so much about war that you get this sense of desperation and the bleakness of war, because the stuff that they're going through it's not all a bed of roses. It's not all like fun space fights. It's the realization that they're actually killing people when they're doing this. And that brings a lot of weight to the show as well. But we talked about its influence on Star Wars, but it's also quite interesting looking at the show's inception and the early influences on the people which created Space Battleship Yamato as well. So it's created by two people. There was lots of legal disputes about who actually owned the series. So you've got Leiji Matsumoto and you've got Yoshinobu Nishizaki. Nishizaki was a manga artist and he did lots of the concept art and sort of stuff about the ship and the wave gun. Matsumoto was the person who first came up with the idea. He wanted to do a story about teenagers in space, was the initial kind of idea. And he cites Robert A. Heinlein's book, Methuselah's Children, as one of his early influences as well. So that's an interesting one because he's drawing from science fiction straight off the bat. But then also at the same time, it's also been said that Matsumoto was looking at stuff like the Poseidon Adventure, which was big at the time.
Definitely.
And a film called Japan Sinks. So this kind of disaster film inspiration as well, like we saw with Black Hole, because disaster movies were so big at the time, it was, how can we create something interesting around a big disaster? And this is the biggest disaster. Earth is under threat. The whole human race will die in 365 days is the main premise of it, unless they get this special radiation fixing machine from this planet millions and millions of light years away. So all of those interesting bits about it, about how it was first created, I think are great. It is unfortunate though that Nishizaki and Matsumoto had that conflict over who owned the franchise, because that kept the whole thing on hold for a lot of years. So that's why it didn't get as many sort of reboots and remakes, I think, in the first early years, or was properly done in the way that we've got it now. But they eventually settled all those disputes in 2003. But I mean, all of that history going into it and those influences, I think it's another interesting aspect of the show in general.
Feels like they've come back hard since that dispute was resolved in 2003, because there's been multiple incarnations of it. There was at least 3 series in the 70s and 80s, 5 odd films in the kind of classic era of it, and then it's been rebooted at least once with 4 or 5 different incarnations of that reboot, or new reboots in different versions since 2003. So they're making up for lost time, aren't they?
Yeah, and I've heard really good things about the latest incarnation of Space Battleship Yamato as well. I think they really flesh out the characters more. They've got more female characters in there as well. And it's supposed to, it looks great with the animation, but I think there is still something about this 70s one, which is obviously it's very iconic, but there is something about looking at this older animation, even though it's simpler. But I just really love the sort of the Technicolor aspect of it, and just because a lot of it would have been hand drawn, and just all of those aspects I think make it really rich.
It's quite a loose animation style, isn't it? It's hand drawn and it's quite rough in places. It feels almost sketchy in places, and I quite like that. It's quite nice. It feels very, I don't know, honest. It's just like, it feels like a lot of hard work's gone into it. But it also, I mean, I think it was quite a rushed production. I think they were working to quite tight timelines when they were making it, and that comes across. But it doesn't look crappy, but it does sort of look like it was a bit rushed, and I don't want to say low effort, but corners were cut. It actually really reminds me of Danger Mouse in terms of its animation.
Danger Mouse, what a great reference.
There's a lot of corners cut in the animation of Danger Mouse, but it's got an awful lot of charm as well. And I think that's what I liked most about it, is that that's a very nostalgic cartoon for me, Danger Mouse. This one really reminded me of that.
Also, yeah, talking about the way that it was made, they lost a lot of episodes, didn't they? Because they'd planned for a longer run initially. Then it wasn't doing as well as they hoped or something. And then they lost a bunch of episodes. So it was cut short. And then it kind of had that resurgence when it was cut into this 2-hour film in Japan that had that big popular influx. And then everybody was like, what is this show?
It's a weird one, isn't it? Because I can see why the reboots might be actually better, and that this might not be the best version of Yamato, because there are production issues. It was rushed, they were cut, they had budget cuts or whatever, or production run cuts, and yet to still have that influence is quite impressive. And I think it comes from that unexpected seriousness of the show. You could be tuning in, it's just another sort of cheap looking anime action series, and you're enjoying that, and like I was saying, being blindsided by the surprising seriousness towards the end of the show, that's what's going to hit audiences and make them pay attention, and then they're going to demand more from that. And I'd be interested to see where it goes in the second series, because there's a lot you can do with it, isn't there? It's a very rounded plot. The Yamato gets home and succeeds in its mission and saves Earth, but then we've just got this cool, iconic ship ready for another mission. It's just a ready-made universe that you can now send characters out to just do something else. There's going to be another threat. There's going to be more bad guys, or the Gamulus are going to come back, or whatever. It lends itself to a long-running franchise quite well, doesn't it?
It's also interesting looking at what Matsumoto did after this as well. He went on to do more space opera series. So he had that real interest in classic science fiction. He did Space Pirate Captain Harlock,
Okay.
which is all over Netflix at the moment, the latest version of that. He did Galaxy Express. He also collaborated on music videos with Daft Punk and Queen. So he's really getting the animation all over the world.
Oh, I love that. So he's had a good career. And also sounds like he's a bit of a master of space opera, just based on the titles of those shows that you read out. They sound like they're right in the wheelhouse of space opera.
Definitely. And this is very much a space opera, isn't it? The first half of the series is them going to different planets in the galaxy, first in our sort of solar system, and having some sort of adventure in the first few episodes before it takes more of a serious tone as they get out of our galaxy into this alien galaxy, and then they're fighting the Gallimimus more and more, and then the tone does take a shift, and they've got episodes where they flash back to what's happening on Earth, and you realise the catastrophe that's happening there and people's backstories and everything they've been through. But in the first few episodes, up to about episode 10, I would say, it's more, here we are, we're near Saturn, and this thing's happening. Here's a bit of info about Saturn, and we need to go here to get some fuel. And I quite like that aspect of it in the first few. It's very simple, but it's got that classic. I mean, it's an anime series, so it's going to have an episodic structure, but it's that classic, almost monster of the week, adventure of the week scenario, which is quite a good way to get into the series.
Yeah, reminiscent of Flash Gordon and Buck Rogers serials. There's always, whether it's a planet in our solar system, but even when they leave the solar system, they're going to stop off on planets on the way or hiding in asteroid belts, creating these fantastic environments for the episode to take place in an episodic way. Though we have this more mature running plot line that's a lot darker and more serious in tone than 40s film serials, but it's still reminiscent of them. It also hits a lot of the Brian Aldiss checklist. It's the world is certainly in peril, and there's a quest that the characters go on, and a villain and a hero at odds with each other, even though Kodai kind of questions that the nature of that relationship, and there's a bit of tension between the captain and the admiral sent after him. At the top of the tree, you've got this psychopathic emperor who fits the bill, and, you know, stars flying past the window, like flowing past the window like wine, was it? And ships launching out of the dark. It's very much got all of those things. It hits almost all of those points on the Aldous checklist. It just feels like there's more serious stuff happening in this that caught me a little bit off guard for space opera, and that's why it feels like it's moving into a more mature direction.
Yeah, because even with those mature sides of it, they've still got room to have fun adventures with the robot doing stuff. And there's one episode where there's a massive alien creature, which is the size of a spaceship, coming in to get them. They go onto a planet full of wasp people from the looks of it, and all this crazy space opera stuff that you want mixed in somewhere amongst all these serious themes. And you talked a bit about the Emperor there. There's another character I wanted to talk about, General Domaru.
Oh yeah, that's him. Yeah.
Who is this kind of character who he kind of builds up a relationship with Captain Akita, because he like their adversaries, they're doing the same thing. They're both leading their ships to fight the other, but there's almost a respect there as well. Like when General Domaru faces Akita for the last time, there's this very sort of like, I respect you and what you're doing. I'm doing this for my planet, my country, and you're doing it for yours, but I've got to stick to my guns and do what I'm doing because I believe what I'm doing is right. And that, again, puts it into this serious territory of actually looking at your adversary, your opponent in these wars, and realizing that you're not much different from each other. And aesthetically, kind of the way that the Gamulus people are depicted is they look almost a bit sort of Nazi-esque in their sort of, they've got like military uniforms on, whereas the Emperor has this kind of flowing cloak like he's an emperor, like you would see in potentially Japanese culture when they had emperors, like the sort of prestige of that particular role. So it's kind of this mix of stylings as well, which kind of make it resonate more with this background of World War.
Yeah, and obviously as well, the real world Yamato backdrop, the ship representing the kind of a bit of an end of an era. I mean, the defeat ultimately of the Japanese Empire and moving to a kind of post-imperial world for Japan. It's interesting to see them kind of calling on those tropes and positioning the characters in that way, because I mean, I don't really know a lot about Japanese cultural views of the war. Obviously, I'm taking a lot from just what's on screen in this series. They're in a weird position that they were our enemies in World War II, and then they were the victims of awful atrocities with the bombings in Nagasaki and Hiroshima. So they've got this weird kind of cultural positioning of being maybe on the wrong side of history, but also the victims of one of the worst atrocities committed in wartime. So that idea of viewing your enemies in a complex way, some of that is important culturally from that sense.
Yeah, and there's also subtext in the series as well as to what is exactly going on the whole time. Like there's certain moments where it's kind of implied that at one point Earth might have been the aggressors in the conflict. So there's little bits like that apparently. Like I haven't seen enough of the series to properly comment on that, but there's moments like that. The whole reason that the alien Gamulus people are invading Earth is because they want to take it over, but they also want to colonize Earth, because that's why they're chucking all these radioactive meteorites at it, so they can live on there. Because there's elements of it that we find out later. It's not explicitly said, I don't think, but the idea that they're terraforming Earth almost to live there. Yeah,
but with absolutely no sympathy. Well, certainly from Dressler. This is one of the interesting things that happens at the end of the series, that Dressler, the evil emperor, is unquestionably evil. He's a complete psycho. He kind of loses his mind towards the end of it, and it just turns into a cackling maniac that all his underlings are afraid of. But that moment where Kodai realizes that he's a bad guy, but the people of Gamulus, not necessarily so. All they wanted to do was live, just like Earth. This kind of, our enemies are no different from us feeling. It just causes a sense of misery about what's going on. Like everyone's a loser, really. Or well, I think he even says that, doesn't he? Like, we're winners here, but behind every winner is a loser. There's always going to be people who lose out. There's victims in all conflict. It's a very powerful message.
Because in the space operas we've looked at previously, it's kind of one-sided, isn't it, in its views? You just see the evil empire as the evil empire. And then eventually, like in Star Wars, you kind of flip that towards the end. But all the stormtroopers, you don't really get a sense of who they are, any of the backdrop to any of that. It's very cut and dry, black and white. Whereas this shows a lot of grey areas. And I think the other anime series, which we're looking at, really delves into that in a really interesting way. So what do you reckon? Shall we move on to Legend of the Galactic Heroes?
Yes, let's move on to the Legend of the Galactic Heroes.
Hi, listeners. If you're enjoying the show and want to support what we do, you can sign up to our Patreon by going to patreon.com/Journey Through Sci-Fi.
And if you subscribe at the warp speed level, you'll get access to our regular bonus episodes, as well as the whole back catalogue.
We've got a host of mini-series like deep dives into the Terminator and Planet of the Apes franchises, as well as the Bad Movie Bunker and reviews of the latest sci-fi films.
Plus, you'll get a say in the kind of content we make for our patrons.
We hope to see you there.
銀河英雄伝説遥か未来銀河系に進出した人類は2つの国家に分かれ終わりなき争いを繰り返していた。そんな中2人の英雄が現れる。銀河帝国ラインハルト・フォン・ローエングラム、そして自由惑星同盟のヤン・ウェンリー。歴史を動かす2人。
Yamato felt big in terms of what we're getting into, because there's so many versions of it. This feels very big to me because I've been meaning to watch this for a long time. I've heard a lot about this and how good it is, but it's quite daunting, not least because there's about 100 episodes-ish of the main series, and then there's all sorts of spin-off series, and also famously this series has like hundreds of named characters. Like, it has an enormous cast of characters and an enormous scope of plot. So, I mean, where to begin? Like, it's based on a Legend of Galactic Heroes. It's based on a series of 10 novels by a Japanese author that tell the story of kind of the latter days of a 150-year-long galactic war, and all of the many, many characters who play a role in that war on both sides, the Free Planets Alliance, the Democratic Free Planets Alliance, and the Galactic Empire, characterized by two main characters. We do have two main characters in amongst our 200 odd other characters, but there's two guys kind of representing each side of the story, which is helpful to get into this series. We've got Yang Wenli and Reinhard von Lohengram, the two rising stars of their respective factions in this enormous war that's going on.
And you're right, it is so daunting going into this, because when we decided to cover this on the show, I looked at the episode list, and seeing 100 episodes, I was like, how are we going to dip our toes into this massive, massive series? But even in the amount that I managed to watch before today's episode, you get a real sense of this world that they've created. It's very rich. It's got so much to it, and it's drawing upon real life comparisons to historical characters, and it's incredibly dense, but at the same time it's so engaging. So you can see why it took so long for him to tell this story, because it is incredibly sprawling. There's loads of stuff happening. So the anime version was released direct to home video in several installments during sort of December 1988 and March 1997. The novel didn't actually get released in English until 2016.
Oh, right.
So even though this is from like the 80s or late 80s, it didn't get a proper English-speaking version for a long time. So I think that adds to the mystery that surrounds it as well.
And I think that may be because it seems a little impenetrable to an outside audience. What I would say from watching some of it for today's recording is that whatever seems daunting and impenetrable about it is counteracted by the fact that it's really, really good. Like, as you say, very engaging. It's an incredible series, and having those two characters actually is incredibly important, because even though it seems huge, it boils down to just the story of two rising stars in respective militaries and what they go through, and their political circumstances around political and personal circumstances around them. That's the story, and that's very engaging, and that's relatively universal. It like you say, it's got historical real world counterparts, but it would fit into that kind of real world framework, whether there were direct analogues or not, because it is quite a universal story about war. It's just a military drama. It actually really reminded me of Sharp. Have you watched any of the Sharp movies? Sean Bean. Yeah. You know, just the way that it's, I think that is much more, Sharp is Sharp. Sharp is about the character of Sharp. But the way it's this enormous military conflict told through the eyes of one character and his personal experiences of the Napoleonic Wars, it feels very similar to that. It's a huge story, but we just see it through the eyes of two characters mainly, for the most part. It really reminded me of that.
That's interesting, because I knew you would like this after watching a few episodes, because the comparison I was making was Dune. It lacks the
totally.
religious bits, but in terms of the galactic politics and what's going on, this is all stuff that I've had many conversations with you about in terms of Dune, just like the backstory of these wars that have been happening and all of these little things that are alluded to. Each episode of this show offers you another part of the history of this 150-year-long war that's been going on. So you find out a little bit more about something that happened in the past in the Empire. It could be that one of the former Kaisers had this little nugget of information about them, or with the Free Planets Alliance, that the guy who created that in the initial stages was there's something that happens there, and then it's just there's so much that they tell you in each episode, and even just little stuff like the technology that they use. There's stuff like there's a character who has robotic eyes, which is just shown out of nowhere, and the way that when they're in long battles, they go into these chambers and they can get like 8 hours sleep in an hour or something like that, and they're just completely rejuvenated. All these little sci-fi elements of technology which are dotted around, and they're not the center point. The center point is very much this political battle and this real war that's happening. And it's got so much to love about it.
Yeah, and those sci-fi tropes, particularly on the Empire side, those sci-fi tropes against the backdrop of an essentially feudal, autocratic society, is a great space opera trope, a great Dune reminiscent trope, also very Game of Thronesy. If anyone's listening to this that hasn't seen these shows and is just listening to the podcast, if you're a fan of Game of Thrones, particularly if you're a fan of House of the Dragon, the kind of the political aspects of Game of Thrones, there's a lot to enjoy here. It's scheming households vying for power, scheming on the other side in the Free Planets Alliance, scheming morally grey, on the surface democratic figures in the Free Planets Alliance, all just scheming and trying to get the best election result and sending millions of people to die in war for the sake of an election. I love all of that stuff. But Galactic Heroes also manages to deliver on the other side of that, which is the action, the space battles, the drama of dogfights in space that we talked about when we looked at Star Wars. All of that is there as well. You've got this grand level scheming at the highest level of politics and little personal arguments that decide the fate of millions, but then you see that fate play out in a dogfight and chaos in a space battle. It's really doing everything. I'm so excited to watch the remainder of this. I've watched a handful of episodes for this show, and there's so much left that I can't even imagine the directions that it's going to go across a 100-episode storyline.
And listeners, if you're getting excited by us just talking about how much we love this show, you can watch it online as well. There's all like 100 episodes have been put from the Laserdisc version on the Internet Archive, which is just archive.org. So you can get access to those. That's how I've been watching them myself. There's just so much to get into with this, but let's talk about these two sides then that we're following. So we've got the Empire and we've got the Free Planets Alliance. So what makes the Empire so different to the Free Planets Alliance then, would you say, Matt?
So like I was saying, it's essentially feudal and autocratic. We have a king, he's called a Kaiser in the translation that I was watching, who ultimately has power, but that's kind of delegated through the nobility, linking it to Dune, like the Landsraad in Dune, this set of noble houses that have high-ranking authority kind of make all the decisions. And we've got Reinhard von Lohengram, who's the main character on the Empire's side of the story, who he's not a high-ranking noble. It's this interesting thing in stories like this where he is a noble, but he's like a scummy noble. He's posh, but he's not that posh.
They've had some sort of, some sort of disgrace or something.
Yeah,
they've lost all their money, haven't they?
Yeah. So you're still noble, you're blue-blooded, but they're not important and they have no money and they have to relocate to perhaps only a medium-sized mansion or whatever it is where they're living in the flashback episodes. But he's extremely ambitious, brutal, but cunning, and looking to basically install himself as the emperor, and looking back on the history of the Empire and saying, well, the first emperor just kind of installed himself, and, why can't I do that? Why can't another man just install himself? It doesn't have to be the bloodline of the emperor. That's his ultimate goal.
It's got a very eugenics background, hasn't it? There's lots of stuff that's alluded to about what the Kaisers were doing previously.
Yeah, well, you talked about the character with the robotic eyes, and he basically wants to see the downfall of his own empire because had he been born earlier in the empire's history, he would have been euthanized because he was born blind or born with problems with his eyes. And now technology's moved on. He can just have robotic eyes and it's fine. But he's carrying this kind of outrage at the history and the behavior of his own empire. He's a creepy dude, though. But he's got this kind of hatred of the empire, and he's also quite ambitious and working his way up and hastening the downfall.
The empire seemed like it was kind of modelled around Germany in some ways. I don't know. There's some sort of. I don't know if there were certain words that I recognised in the way that they named their spaceships and things like that.
Oh yeah, there's loads of German language. I think isn't the theme tune sung in German? Maybe.
Yeah. So it's all of that, which is very much like painting the empire as potentially, if the Nazis had taken over, this is what we could have been looking at.
Yeah, and on the face of it. I think it's fair to say that the Empire are cast as the villains. They're an empire. They just want to take over the galaxy, the universe, whatever, and crush all rebellion. And we've got our rebel characters who are personifying democracy and are rising up against this tyrannical empire. But that quite quickly evaporates. That, there's incompetency and bureaucracy on both sides at the higher levels. And there's respectable characters who have good intentions at the lower levels on both sides. And that seems to be becoming more important in the episodes that I've seen. I think still at the core of it, the goal of the Free Planets Alliance is cast as the good guys. But then they're led by these sort of selfish, incompetent politicians who are self-serving. But Yang Wen-li, I think, is the spirit of the Free Planets Alliance. He's just a good guy trying to do his best and act according to his morality. Reluctantly, I think at times, kind of, he doesn't always seem too happy about it. He doesn't want to be a hero. He doesn't want to be in charge, but he's accepting all of that and kind of doing the best he can. And then cast alongside Reinhardt, whose motivations are actually quite good. He's very angry at the Empire. His sister's essentially been kidnapped and forced to be a child bride, and that's his main motivation. But I also think he's very just ambitious in his own right, because he could go on this quest to sort of like try and free his sister, but his idea of how he's going to do that is to take over the entire universe, basically. So I'll set my sister free, but along the way I'm going to become ruler of the entire universe.
Yeah, and I think it's the way that they, like you were saying, it's the way that they make each society good and bad. They fully shade out the grey, don't they? Because the Empire, the Kaiser, you would think he's this evil, tyrannical ruler, the initial Kaiser that they have, but he's not. He's someone who ends up in power because his brothers were trying to kill each other and he just somehow happened to become the Kaiser. And he's very much like, well, if Reinhardt takes over, maybe that's what should happen. Maybe we need someone else to take charge. So there's that aspect to it. And then with the Free Planets Alliance, you've got this democratic society, but you've also got real fascist elements in there as well. You've got this patriotic army which just go around beating up anyone who says anything against what the sort of like what's being said in the I don't even know the terms for it in their society, but anybody who speaks up.
Yeah, early on you've got a character who loses her husband in a battle, in a space battle. He's a friend of Yang Wen-li. And she goes to this massive speech by, I think he's the Secretary of Defense or something like that. He's a high-ranking politician who is one of these Free Planets Alliance characters who just goes out and bangs the drum for war. He's got a vested interest in continuing the war because it increases his own power, as his political role benefits from there being a long-lasting war. And she speaks out against the message that he's delivering, the speech he's delivering, because he's basically got to try and, in that moment, he's trying to sell 1.5 million deaths as a good thing, basically. They died defending the Alliance and defending democracy, so hey, great news, like another win for the Free Planets Alliance. And that's the kind of message that he's giving, and she speaks out against that, and then she gets attacked by this skull mask wearing patriotic Knights Corps.
And it's interesting seeing the contrast between Reinhard and Yang Wen-li, because they're like, Yang is very much, like you say, is a reluctant hero. He wants peace, and he hates the fact that all of these bigwigs are trying to propel the war. And in between him and Reinhardt, you've also got this planet which is funding the wars as well, which you see every once in a while. This kind of in-between planet that isn't part of the Free Planets Alliance and isn't part of the Empire, but they're funding everything and they want to propel it. So they're doing lots of shady stuff behind the scenes. There's so much to it. And also the fact that, so the way that this galaxy works is they've got a whole load of planets. And if you look at a diagram of it, you can find a diagram on the internet. So it's basically split off into two sections. So you've got the Empire on one side, you've got the Free Planets Alliance on the other, and then the only way to get to either side of the galaxy is to go through this small area in between. So that means all of their big battles happen in between this short area, and there's this one strategic location called the Fortress of Isilon, which is owned by the Empire at the start, and that's kind of the route through. So they kind of have a bit of a foothold, and then it goes into so much stuff about what happens when they lose that foothold, and then just the way that it's set out. It's very, we're over here, you're over there, but so that's why it's lasted for so long, because they are at a stalemate. They can't beat each other because of the way that the galaxy is mapped out, and each part of their zones has different planets in it, and you see these different planets, they've got slightly different styles to them. The planets are comparable to different countries, and there's so much in it which is just so detailed and really fleshes out this world that you can go in at any point, and you do feel a bit overwhelmed, but the more you find out about it, the more intrigued you are to find out the reasons behind all of this stuff.
And it still has a highly episodic structure as well, doesn't it? There's an enormous story being told, but most of the episodes that I've seen are self-contained. And often what they'll do is show how the story is impacting one individual or a small group or one planet. So there's a campaign to kind of invade the Empire, and there's a whole episode that just plays out on one planet. The Alliance invades loads of planets at the same time, and it kind of backfires, and it's they make a bit of a mess of it. But we just see how that plays out for one character who is deployed on one planet as things start to fall apart. I don't think we've seen him in a previous episode, and I don't know if we'll go on to see him later in the series. But it's just his experience of a huge military operation going awry and a plan kind of disintegrating in real time, and the human impact that that's having. And that's something I was really enjoying about the show, and I think slightly strays away from the typical space opera mold. It is about the grand galactic events, which feels very space opera, and it has those massive space battles, but then showing how it plays out on a personal level in a very small location is something different, something that I don't think we've really seen before. And it's not just about how it personally affects Yang Wen-li or Reinhard, the two main characters. It's showing the human impact of galactic warfare.
And that's in the title as well, isn't it? It's the Legend of the Galactic Heroes, and it's looking at the real life portrayal of these characters and how they're viewed by the societies that they live in. because when Yang Wen Li goes around, he's lauded as this military hero. There's one episode when he's in a bar, and then everyone just starts clapping and playing the national anthem or something, and then they all stand up. It's things like that, but then he is a real person. So it's kind of like looking at the aspects we see in space operas where you've got a hero saving the galaxy, and we see this hero, and then he's saving the day, but then what are the real things that are going on with that particular person? What are the motives? What's happening behind the scenes? It really goes into details of that, and it kind of unravels this almost it unravels the fantasy element of having a space hero, doesn't it?
Yeah. It feels like a very modern twist on space opera for that reason. Unraveling the fantasy is a great way of describing it, because we've talked about how space opera is space fantasy a lot of the time. This is so serious. There's very little humour in what I've seen, or the humour is, if there is humour, it's sort of satirical and kind of a wink and a nod rather than a pervy robot or a drunk vet that you'd see in Yamato. It's the whole thing just has a much more serious tone to it and takes a step away from the fantasy side of space opera. I like what you said, yeah, unraveling the fantasy. It's a great sort of lens to look at this series through.
Whereas, so Yamato, we talked about the criticisms there of like the fan service element of the female characters in there. I think the one thing that this has been criticised about is its lack of female characters. I've seen one female character in the episodes that I've seen who seems like a strongish character. She's in sort of like the military service and she's a bit fleshed out, but I can see potentially where that might come from.
If it's a common criticism, then I do think it's a valid one, because even in the amount of episodes I've seen, just the sheer number of characters, if people are saying that, having seen all of it, that there aren't enough women in it, there's so many characters, even in the first few dozen episodes.
Saying about there's so many characters, I've read as well that there's loads and loads of threads and Reddit threads and theories about who all of these characters' real life historical counterparts are.
Right.
There's loads of things about like maybe Reinhard is this person and this person. It's hard for me to make a comment on that, and I'm sure we're probably in the same boat because I don't know loads about the history that this may have been based on. But there's certain things which I noticed, like it's very Napoleonic, isn't it? Just Napoleon, I think, is a great example, because even the way that they fight their battles, I think they compare it to Napoleon in certain bits. It's strategic. They're coming up with strategies. It's a bit like they're playing battleships because of the way it's all set out. And again, they look like ships, look like naval vessels, some of the spaceships. So the Napoleon elements there. There's one episode which we mentioned, which we've talked about off mic. There's an episode where it's very much like Julius Caesar.
Yep.
Do you remember that one and what happened there?
Yeah, I mean, we just got a planet of like Romans, basically, hanging out in togas and being very decadent and causing problems for the empire. But that episode ends with a Julius Caesar being stabbed scene that is very clearly influenced by Caesar's death. He's stabbed by all his comrades and quite brutally, like, dies a very slow and painful death being stabbed by his underlings, and it's pretty brutal.
Yeah, and I mean, seeing that made me think, are there moments that I'm missing in some of these battles? Are there comparisons to stuff that's happened in history that they're making here? So I think if you have that prior knowledge going into this, you might get a whole different reading of the show. Yeah,
maybe one for history buffs. I think that the sense that I got as not having that sort of wide-ranging military history knowledge was that, in contrast to Yamato, that seems to be so inherently linked to a Japanese military and cultural identity, Legend of the Galactic Heroes feels like it's trying to create an analogue for the entire world's military conflicts, or at least autocracy versus democracy, wherever that conflict may have existed on Earth throughout history. It's much more it's much bigger in scale in that sense. It's not just about Japanese history. It's world military history expanded out to the galactic stage.
Yeah, I would agree with you there. And they've got, you can see where certain comparisons, like the obvious, maybe I say obvious, some of the comparisons which I could see were, so you've talked about the guy with the robotic eyes. He's been compared to Machiavelli quite a bit.
Mm-hmm.
There's
Oberstein, yep.
Yep, Oberstein. And Reinhardt is a little bit Hitler, a little bit Napoleon. He seems like an amalgamation of a lot of different characters there. I don't know who Wen Li would be.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know about Reinhardt as Hitler. I think that Reinhardt is too likable. Like he's a brat, I would say. They always refer to him as that brat.
Maybe the previous Kaisers were more Hitler.
Yeah,
I think eugenics and stuff.
I think so. The original Kaiser in particular, Rudolph, and I think that, I don't know, just at least from the episodes I watched, I'm uncomfortable with the comparison to Hitler because I quite like Reinhardt. I think that he is obviously a bit of a bastard, but he's a likable bastard, and I think certainly within the Empire story, you're on his side and you want him to succeed and make hhis way up. Yang, I don't know, maybe there's a sense of like American Revolutionary War figures. He's that kind of is more general, I guess, to the Alliance because they're a breakaway former imperial colony, or that's the past history, and they're trying to become their own thing and just live away from the Empire. So maybe there's some American, early pre-American figures and leaders there, but I don't really know enough about that, to be fair.
Yeah, I think it's tricky for us to make comments on those particular bits
because
we don't have enough of a historical background for it. But something I can make a comment about is the other characters which are supporting Reinhardt and Yang. So especially with Reinhardt, his childhood friend is like his military number 2 in this, isn't he? And I think he kind of acts as his conscience. And in the first few episodes, or in some of the early episodes, so the character's called Siegfried, and he has the hots for Reinhardt's sister as well. So early on in their childhood, Reinhardt's sister said, look after Reinhardt and make sure that he's doing okay. So he's really taken that to heart. So he's kind of got that love interest in there, and he's doing that for those reasons. But he acts as Reinhardt's conscience almost, and he's trying to keep him on the right path. So I think maybe if any Hitler comparisons come around later, could be from seeing Reinhardt go overboard and lose it.
I'd be interested to see how that relationship develops over the course of the series, because there are moments where Siegfried has to caution him and just say, take a step back, or, you need to think with a cooler head. He is that voice of reason, as Reinhardt's willing to do basically anything to take over the Empire.
But their tactics are generally peaceful, aren't they? They try not to have anybody killed when they can. They try to avoid bloodshed. There's one mission that Siegfried goes on where he manages to not kill anyone. And there's little bits like that. That's the same mission with the Julius Caesar references.
Oh, of course,
Except, of course, for the character who's basically Caesar, who
he's the
gets
only one
killed.
who dies, yeah. But he's been given authority by Reinhardt to basically annihilate the entire planet if it won't comply. But Siegfried, is able to dispel the situation without any further bloodshed.
Which shows his good nature. And then Yang's kind of complemented by this young boy who he looks after. I haven't seen enough.
Don't know the deal. I don't know what the relationship is there. He refers to him as his ward, so it's a Dick Grayson, Bruce Wayne relationship, I guess.
Yeah, I can imagine it being like, I haven't seen enough for the backstory of that, but I can imagine it being something like he saved him from some catastrophe, some war or something like that, and then has been looking after him ever since. And then at the same time, his female lieutenant as well is quite a good gauge of his character, because she remembers him in crisis situations.
Oh, yeah.
So you're getting fleshing out of his character through that, and just seeing other people react to these galactic heroes is a good way to ground them in the reality.
Yeah, and both of those conscience characters, if we can call them that, for Yang, basically, from what I've seen, most of what they're trying to do is get him to get enough sleep and stop drinking brandy all the time, because that's how That's how Yang kind of copes with things. He's basically constantly boozing, not eating healthily, and not getting enough rest as he...
And he loves to sleep, though, when he can, though. Like, when he gets his lions, he's like, nope, don't wake me up. And again, that makes him quite a likable character just because everyone can identify with that.
Yeah, he's a good hero. Everything... That's what's so interesting about the setup is that everything does lean towards the Free Planets Alliance being the good guys of the story. Like, I don't know if that's a Western take on it because they are the democratic institution. So I feel like we're supposed to side with them. But even Yang is a more pure and likable character than Reinhardt. Reinhardt is likable in a slightly villainous way, but everything slightly leans to the Free Planets Alliance being the quote unquote good guys. But it's just not black and white like that. As we were talking about before, the wider political context is there's a lot more grey areas on both sides.
So no one can be seen as purely the good guy or purely the bad guy, which is why it's so interesting and so engaging, because it's fleshing out the characters. You're seeing all of these different aspects, and at the same time, each episode you're getting a different insight into the world, and you're getting some little bit of sci-fi technology in there. I think it's just the whole package in terms of all of that. The one thing I would say is I can't see why it hasn't got... I don't know if it's just from my frame of reference, but I didn't know much about this at all going in, other than your recommendation, and you've been recommended it by other people as well. So I don't know how this one passed me by, because it seems like such a massive sprawling series.
Well, I think you might know a bit more about the history of anime, and in particular the history of anime exports. So we're talking late 80s. I don't know what was on the scene in terms of what was being exported to America. Would Dragon Ball be out by now in the late 80s?
Yeah.
I'm just trying,
at least the first series.
I'm just trying to think of what was resonating outside of Japan in terms of anime, because it wouldn't be huge in the 80s. Films like Akira are making a splash, but anime series, I'm not quite so sure. And this is dense and impenetrable, whereas maybe Dragon Ball is a little bit less. It seems dense and impenetrable to me now because there's like a million episodes of it, but just in terms of the content, the tone, the style, my understanding of Dragon Ball is it's mostly just dudes becoming more powerful and fighting for 20 minutes every episode.
That's basically
right?
it, yeah.
So that's easily marketable in any territory. You just need to translate that, and kids can understand a guy getting hench and punching another guy. That's fine. Whereas this is a nuanced political sci-fi drama that is harder to market. And then you add the fact that it's hundreds of characters, incredibly complicated backstory, all of that. It's just not, I don't think it's that easy to sell.
Yeah, you're right.
I feel like in the late 80s, that's not easy to sell overseas. Even Yamato, you strip away the strictly Japanese context, it does become quite easily marketable. We've got some teenagers on a spaceship on a quest to save the Earth. That's great. Easily done. You can sell that in any territory. I think that's what makes it hard for Legend of Galactic Heroes. If it was made today, brand new, I think it'd be an absolute smash, because anime is huge all over the world. I think this would be enormous, but just not getting that backing in the late 80s overseas, I think it's going to struggle. And now it's 30 years old or more, so there's less motivation for companies to pick it up and push it on Crunchyroll or whatever they've got.
I mean, they have got the new series, which is a retelling of this. Like, they've redone all the animation, they're redoing it again.
Fair enough.
But again, now the market is so saturated with stuff. It's always going to be a hard sell with something like this, but I think it's a shame that it isn't lauded over as much as perhaps it could be, because just in terms of how interesting an example it is. But you're right about all the sort of marketing, because even if you look at something like Evangelion, which is quite nuanced in what's going on, it's still a big robot fighting aliens. Whereas this, there's not as much of that. It's very talky. It's very much about what's happening politically.
Yeah. And And like I was saying, like it does deliver on the space battles, but it's not like an every episode thing. You're not guaranteed a space battle. It actually builds up to them so that they are satisfying in the narrative, and that when we get to those battles, we know quite a lot about the tactics and all of that. So we're seeing the action play out, but we actually know what the military leadership is thinking and how many ships they're deploying and all of that. You know a lot more than you would in most space battle scenes.
So do you think with this anime series, Legend of the Galactic Heroes, we found an effective, serious space opera?
I mean, we've already seen some seriousness. There's some good stuff in Yamato, and obviously we talked about like Empire Strikes Back being, an incredible, dark, serious space opera. But I'm so excited to continue with Legend of the Galactic Heroes and just see where this story goes. It feels so enormous in scope that it feels like the most appropriate format for space opera, because space opera can be so large and grand that it's really exciting to have something that takes those tropes and plays it out across 100 episodes, because even 6 odd hours of a Flash Gordon serial is not long enough, and the filmmakers weren't interested in getting into some of the more nuanced detail. It just wasn't what was in scope in those serials. So yeah, I'm excited to see how a serious space opera plays out over the course of 100 episodes.
Same here. And I think it's really taken hold of the word opera in this as well, because it is operatic. It's grand in scale. There's real moments of drama in this series. And I think all of that is really contributing to making it a very serious space opera. It hasn't got as many of the fantasy elements, like we said. It's not got crazy aliens every episode. It's got blood running down the palace steps plenty of times, all of this kind of thing. But it's really just giving you a more grounded sense of that space opera and that grand scale, which I think is so interesting. So yeah, I'll definitely be dipping back into the 100 episode strong series that this is.
And we'll come back to this on Patreon. So in a few months' time, when we finish this, we'll do an episode with our reflections on the series overall. So if you're interested in that, listeners, do join us on patreon.com/journeythrough-sci-fi for more.
Yes, please do. We've always got loads of great bonus content over there. But speaking of content, what do we have for our listeners next time on the show, Matt?
So we are taking a step forward and a step back at the same time. We are going back to the early days of this series of space opera and looking at the 1970s and 80s versions of Flash Gordon and Buck Rogers, returning to, for me, the classic versions of those characters, not the originals, but really, really in my mind, the 1980 Flash Gordon movie with one of the greatest soundtracks of all time, and the 1979 Buck Rogers in the 25th Century TV series, but also TV movies, I think, are available, packaging the episodes up.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to dipping back into those, because in the space of 50 years since the film serials came out, seeing what's changed, the influence of Star Wars, of course, the influence of all the other stuff we've covered so far on the show. So I'm very much looking forward to seeing those again and revisiting those nostalgic classics.
But that's all for this time, listeners. Do join us for those next time. Thanks for listening to this episode of Journey Through Sci-Fi.
You can find us at journeythroughsci-fi.com, where you can find links to our social media and join the conversation.
If you've enjoyed what you've heard and want to support us, why not leave us a review on your podcast app of choice? It really helps new people find the show.
You can also support us on Patreon at patreon.com/journeythroughsci-fi, where you can receive exclusive bonus episodes every month.
Don't forget to subscribe to the show, and we'll see you again next time for another Journey Through Sci-Fi.